My name is Dr. Clara Sterling. I am 32 years old, and my days are measured in the rhythmic beep of heart monitors and the frantic, adrenaline-soaked minutes of saving shattered lives. Exactly half a decade ago, my older sister systematically dismantled the foundation of my life, severing the deep familial bonds I had desperately tried to maintain, using nothing more than a single, meticulously calculated fabrication. She sat our parents down and spun a masterclass of deceit, convincing them that I had completely abandoned my rigorous medical education and dropped out of school. She painted a portrait of a chaotic, dishonest daughter, insisting that I was hiding dark secrets from the family. She looked them in the eye and told them that I had recklessly thrown my entire future away. And the most devastating part of it all? My parents eagerly swallowed every single poisonous word without a shred of hesitation. The emotional execution was swift. They completely blocked my phone number. They ceased opening or answering any of my emails. They were conspicuously absent on the day I walked across the stage at my medical school graduation. They were ghosts on the day of my wedding, leaving empty chairs where my family should have been. For 5 agonizingly long years, I was forced to navigate the world as though I had been erased from their reality, living as if I simply no longer existed to the people who brought me into this world. And then, fate orchestrated a violently poetic reunion. Late one stormy night, the wail of sirens pierced the darkness as my estranged sister was rushed through the automatic doors of my trauma bay, bleeding out and teetering on the absolute brink of death. The frantic hospital dispatch immediately paged the chief trauma surgeon to intervene and pull the patient back from the edge. That surgeon was me. When my terrified mother finally looked up through her tears in the chaotic waiting area and saw my full title stitched proudly in dark thread across the breast of my crisp white medical coat, the shock was so visceral that she clamped her hands onto my father's arm with such sheer force that it left deep, dark bruises on his skin. That precise moment in the fluorescent-lit corridor was the exact second the colossal tower of lies finally came crashing down into irreversible ruin. But to truly comprehend the seismic weight of that single, breathless moment, we have to rewind the clock to the very last time my father ever looked at me with an ounce of genuine pride. Our story traces back to a modest, impeccably clean house in the bustling suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. It was the crisp, biting autumn of 2019. We were sitting around our polished oak kitchen table, the epicenter of our family's fragile dynamic. Growing up, everyone in our neighborhood knew there were 2 daughters residing in the Sterling household. It was a universally acknowledged, unspoken truth that my older sister Vanessa was the undisputed golden child and the absolute favorite. Vanessa possessed a magnetic radiance. She was undeniably beautiful, unapologetically loud, intoxicatingly charming, and effortlessly funny. She wielded her charisma like a weapon, capable of walking into any crowded room and utterly dominating the atmosphere within mere minutes. It seemed as though the entire world bent to her will. Our parents absolutely adored her. Her teachers constantly praised her. Even the passing neighbors loved her. As a result, my parents essentially constructed the entirety of their waking world directly around Vanessa's radiant orbit. We were a working-class family attempting to project a veneer of suburban perfection. Dad spent his days exhausted, working grueling shifts at a local steel manufacturing plant. Mom meticulously managed the finances, working in bookkeeping. Despite our modest means, they cared deeply, almost obsessively, about societal appearances. And Vanessa, with her flawless smile and trendy clothes, always looked absolutely perfect. I, on the other hand, was the profoundly quiet daughter. I was the introverted girl who always had heavy, worn books resting in her lap. At loud, chaotic family parties, while Vanessa effortlessly made the entire room erupt into laughter, I was the one tucked away in the shadowy corners, silently devouring complex biology textbooks. I was never a rebellious teenager. I wasn't a difficult child who caused trouble. I was simply, tragically, invisible. There is a profound, aching difference between being occasionally ignored by busy parents and growing up with the suffocating, pervasive feeling that nobody in your own home ever truly sees you. That oppressive isolation was the defining characteristic of my entire childhood. In the 8th grade, my relentless studying finally paid off when I miraculously made it all the way to the highly competitive state science fair. Out of hundreds of aspiring students, only one single individual from our middle school managed to qualify for the event. It was me. However, fate had a cruel sense of timing. That exact same weekend, Vanessa was scheduled to perform in a minor amateur community theater production. You do not have to guess where my parents chose to direct their attention and attendance. When the science fair concluded and I proudly walked through our front door clutching a hard-earned second-place ribbon, Dad barely even bothered to lift his gaze from the glowing television screen. "That's nice, Clara," he muttered dismissively. He didn't pause the game. He never even bothered to ask what my exhaustive scientific project was actually about. After enduring years of that same hollow indifference, I simply stopped expecting him to ever ask. So, I channeled all of my repressed emotional energy and profound loneliness directly into my academic pursuits. I focused with laser precision on maintaining flawless grades. I buried myself in grueling advanced placement classes. I ruthlessly hunted down merit-based scholarships. I made a quiet, desperate vow to myself in the dark. I told myself that one day, against all odds, I would accomplish something of such monumental, undeniable magnitude that they would finally have no choice but to stop and actually notice me. And for one incredibly fleeting, fragile little moment, they actually did. The crisp envelope that changed the entire trajectory of my existence arrived in the mail, bearing the crest of the University of Washington, UW, School of Medicine. Getting accepted into their fiercely competitive medical program changed absolutely everything. Dad was the one who carefully sliced open the thick letter as we sat around that same kitchen table. He held the heavy parchment in his calloused hands and read the official text twice to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Then, he slowly lowered the paper and looked at me. He really, truly looked at me. "The University of Washington," he murmured slowly, the syllables tasting foreign on his tongue. "That's a real, highly respected medical school." And then, he delivered the 5 elusive words I had spent my entire miserable childhood desperately waiting to hear. "Maybe you'll make something of yourself." His delivery wasn't particularly warm. It wasn't dripping with paternal, loving affection. But coming from my stoic, emotionally distant father, it felt like an enormous, earth-shattering declaration of validation. Mom was similarly swept up in the unexpected triumph, spending the entire evening dramatically calling every relative in our extended family tree. "Clara got into medical school," she kept repeating into the receiver, over and over. In all my years on Earth, I had never once heard that specific, resonant timbre of pride in her voice when she talked about me before. Later that evening, as we sat down for a celebratory dinner, I casually glanced across the table at Vanessa. Her lips were pulled back into a wide, practiced smile, but her eyes were completely dead. They didn't match the joy on her mouth. At the time, blinded by my own sudden influx of parental approval, I foolishly chose to ignore the sinister shadow passing over her face. I now know, with painful clarity, that was the exact, precipitating moment she fundamentally realized the family's glowing spotlight was slowly but surely moving away from her. And Vanessa, deeply addicted to being the absolute center of our family's universe, could never, ever survive that kind of ego death. Shortly after I packed up my belongings and moved across the country to the damp, rain-slicked streets of Seattle, her entire demeanor shifted. She suddenly started calling me constantly on the phone. She relentlessly asked probing questions about my eccentric medical professors, the crippling difficulty of my anatomy classes, the personalities of my new roommates, and the grueling minutiae of my daily schedule. She listened intently and seemingly remembered every single microscopic detail I shared. In my profound naivete, I genuinely thought she had finally started to care about me as a human being. I desperately wanted to believe that the prestigious title of medical student had finally magically rendered me worthy of being considered her true sister. I was tragically, catastrophically wrong. I wasn't building a sibling bond. I was unwittingly feeding her a steady stream of highly sensitive intelligence. Every moment of academic weakness, every tearful confession of fear, every vulnerable, lonely moment I experienced in that distant city, she meticulously hoarded and stored all of it away in her mental arsenal. The heavy, suffocating pressure of my third year of medical school was the exact moment the fragile architecture of my life finally cracked wide open. My absolute best friend in the entire world, a brilliantly fiery woman named Maya Lin, received a devastating, apocalyptic medical diagnosis: stage 4 ovarian cancer. Maya had endured a brutal childhood, growing up entirely within the cold, unforgiving walls of the state foster care system. She had absolutely nobody else in this world. She had no parents to hold her hand, no biological siblings to donate blood. She had absolutely no familial safety net to fall back into. In the vast, sprawling emptiness of her universe, she just had me, and I owed her everything. Maya had literally carried me on her back through the agonizing trials of our first year of medical school, pulling me up when I nearly collapsed entirely from the crushing academic and emotional stress. On the darkest nights, when my parents completely ignored my desperate phone calls, simply because Vanessa was having a dramatically rough week at work, Maya was the one fiercely loyal person who sat right beside me on the cold, hard apartment floor, wrapped an arm around my trembling shoulders, and adamantly told me to just keep going. So when the universe dealt her this lethal hand and she got terminally sick, there was absolutely no universe in which I could simply walk away and leave her to die alone. I took decisive action. I marched directly into the austere office of the medical school dean. I sat in the heavy leather chair and exhaustively explained the entire heartbreaking situation. The school administration was incredibly sympathetic and formally approved an official, structured leave of absence. The arrangement was for one single semester. Every single detail was meticulously documented. Everything was completely legal and sanctioned by the university board. My concrete, unwavering plan was to return to my grueling clinical rotations at the start of January. I immediately packed my bags and moved into Maya's small, dimly lit apartment. I became her absolute lifeline, carefully driving her to and from endless, nauseating rounds of chemotherapy. I spent countless agonizing nights sitting by her side, holding her frail, shaking hand at 3 a.m. when the bone-deep pain of the tumors became utterly unbearable. One particularly bleak night, severely sleep-deprived, utterly exhausted, and dangerously emotional, I made the single most catastrophic mistake of my adult life. I picked up my phone and called Vanessa. In a moment of sheer vulnerability, seeking the warmth of a sister, I poured my heart out and told her everything. I detailed the horrifying severity of Maya's grim cancer diagnosis. I thoroughly explained the officially sanctioned leave of absence I had taken from my medical studies. I reiterated my firm, documented plan to return to Seattle and finish my degree. Vanessa's voice over the cellular connection sounded incredibly soft, entirely supportive, and dripping with what I thought was genuine empathy. "Oh my God, Clara," she whispered dramatically into the receiver. "I am so incredibly sorry you're going through this." She then offered a seemingly protective piece of advice. "Don't worry about a thing. I won't tell Mom and Dad about the leave. If they hear you aren't in class, they'll just panic and overreact." Exactly 3 days after that phone call, the entire foundation of my life spectacularly exploded into ash. The assault came under the cover of darkness. Dad called my cell phone at precisely 11 p.m. I was currently sitting in a sterile room, keeping a silent vigil right beside Maya's beeping hospital bed, when the shrill ringtone shattered the quiet. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Your sister finally came clean and told us absolutely everything," he stated, his voice ringing with a terrifying, absolute coldness. The bottom completely dropped out of my stomach. Panic flared in my chest. "What on earth are you talking about, Dad?" I stammered. The disgraceful dropping out, The constant, filthy lies? The secret boyfriend you ran off with? He spat the accusations out like venom. I was so profoundly shocked that I stood up so fast my heavy plastic chair violently slammed backward into the pristine hospital wall. "Dad, listen to me. None of that is true," I pleaded into the microphone. "Don't bother lying anymore. Vanessa sat us down and showed us the concrete proof," he countered instantly, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "What fabricated proof could she possibly have?" I demanded, my voice trembling with desperate rage. "She specifically warned us that you would vehemently deny it all," he replied, perfectly parrying my defense with Vanessa's pre-planted manipulation. Suddenly, I heard the rustle of the phone changing hands, and my mother got on the line, hysterically crying. "How could you possibly do this? How could you hide something this massive from your own flesh and blood, Clara?" she sobbed. "Mom, please, you have to listen to me. I didn't hide a single thing from you," I begged, tears now streaming down my own exhausted face. "I legally filed for a temporary medical leave of absence to care for a dying friend. I can literally email you the official stamped paperwork right this second. I can give you the direct phone number to my dean of medicine," but it was entirely futile. Dad snatched the phone back, his voice hardening into impenetrable steel. "Do not ever call this house again until you are finally ready to admit what you've done and tell us the actual truth." And with a sharp, sickening click, he violently hung up the phone. 4 excruciatingly short minutes. That is exactly how much time it took for my biological family to completely and utterly erase my existence from their lives. Roughly 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from Vanessa. "I'm so incredibly sorry, Clara. The guilt was eating me alive. I absolutely had to tell them the truth," the digital text read. To twist the knife deeper into my back, she actually had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to add a bright red, cartoonishly broken heart emoji to the end of the message. I stood paralyzed in the desolate hospital corridor, staring blankly at that glowing, toxic message on the screen, until the tears flowed so heavily that my vision completely blurred out. Then, the sharp, rhythmic machine attached to Maya's failing body loudly beeped from inside the room, aggressively dragging my fractured mind violently back into the grim reality of the present. My closest friend in the universe was actively dying a slow, agonizing death just on the other side of that door. And somehow, through a masterstroke of sociopathic manipulation, my own sister had flawlessly painted me to look like the treacherous, deceitful villain of the family. But I didn't just give up. I genuinely, desperately tried to fix the shattered pieces of my family. God, I tried with every ounce of my fading energy. Over the agonizing course of the next 5 days, I aggressively dialed their landline exactly 14 separate times. I was met with dead air. My father had gone into the telecommunications provider and officially blocked my cell phone number from reaching the house. Undeterred, I tried Mom's mobile. Then, I realized my mother had deliberately blocked me on her personal device, too. I pivoted to digital communication. I frantically typed out lengthy, detailed emails explaining the entire truth. I meticulously scanned and attached every single page of my official university leave paperwork. I prominently included my dean's direct office phone number in bold text, begging them to just make a simple 5-minute verification call. The result? Absolutely zero response. The digital void swallowed my pleas. Desperate for a tangible connection, I sat down and poured my shattered heart out, mailing a deeply emotional, handwritten letter through the postal service. Exactly 5 days later, the envelope reappeared in my Seattle mailbox, completely unopened. Slashed aggressively across the front of the paper, I instantly recognized my own mother's distinct, looping handwriting, indicating it was to be returned to the sender. Out of options, I picked up the phone and called my Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor was my father's sister, and historically, she was the absolute only person in our vast, extended family who had ever consistently treated me with any degree of fairness and respect. Eleanor, horrified by the situation, promised to intervene and tried bravely talking sense into Dad. The moment she brought up my name, he immediately hung up the phone on her too. It was in the deafening, profound silence of that total rejection that I finally, painfully understood a massive underlying truth. This horrifying excommunication wasn't really just about the brilliant, venomous lie Vanessa had spun. This absolute abandonment was the final, inevitable culmination of over 20 years of deeply ingrained psychological conditioning. My parents had always, unconditionally, believed whatever Vanessa told them first. Always. It was an unbreakable reflex. They actively chose not to investigate my side of the story. They didn't call the dean, and they didn't open the letters because, deep down in their flawed hearts, they were already fully primed and quietly prepared to think the absolute worst of me. Vanessa hadn't actually tricked them. She had simply handed them the convenient, socially acceptable permission slip they needed to finally discard the daughter they never truly understood. On the dawn of the 6th day, the fight finally drained out of me, and I officially stopped calling. I didn't stop because the deep, agonizing love I had for my family suddenly evaporated. I stopped because I finally accepted the cold, hard reality that there was absolutely nobody on the other end of the line willing to listen. The grueling, bleak winter set in, and Maya finally succumbed to the disease and died in late December. Her passing wasn't marked by violent struggle. She slipped away quietly, almost peacefully. I was sitting in the sterile room, firmly holding her fragile, cooling hand, when the jagged green line on the heart monitor finally flattened out into a continuous, piercing tone. As she took her last breath, there was absolutely no biological family there to surround her. There were no crowds of sobbing, devoted loved ones to completely fill the suffocatingly small hospital room. There was just me, bearing the entirety of the grief alone. I took on the crushing burden of arranging her incredibly modest funeral all by myself. On the day of the memorial, a grand total of exactly 6 people bothered to show up. I stood behind the wooden podium, gazing out at the vast, echoing expanse of nearly entirely empty church pews, choking back sobs as I read a heartfelt eulogy, utilizing every ounce of my willpower, just trying desperately not to physically collapse onto the floor. Later that same hollow, freezing night, sitting completely alone in the deafening silence of her empty apartment, I was packing her things when I found a small, brightly colored sticky note carefully tucked away inside the heavy pages of her massive gross anatomy textbook. Her familiar, severely weakened handwriting violently shook across the tiny square of paper. The message was a profound command from the grave. Finish what you started, Clara. Become the brilliant doctor I already know you are. I broke down. I cried significantly harder that dark, solitary night than I had in the entire previous 6 agonizing months combined. But when the tears finally ran dry, a cold, unbreakable resolve settled into my bones. I wiped my face, forcefully reopened my glowing laptop screen, navigated to the university portal, and I firmly re-enrolled in my medical courses. I marched back into the grueling crucible of medical school, entirely devoid of a family. I operated with absolutely zero emotional support from the people who raised me. I had absolutely no financial safety net to catch me if I stumbled. I willingly took on massive, suffocating amounts of extra student loans to keep the lights on. I worked brutal, exhausting extra hours at a side job just to survive. I practically lived off of the cheap, stale leftovers I could scavenge from the harsh glow of the hospital cafeteria. And through it all, I ruthlessly pushed my mind and body significantly harder than I had ever previously thought was humanly possible. Because the harsh, unforgiving reality of medical school is that it absolutely does not pause the curriculum just because your emotional heart is entirely broken. Sick, dying patients still desperately need your undivided care. Terrifying, career-defining board exams still happen exactly on schedule. Grueling clinical rotations still relentlessly demand you be present and perfect at the agonizing crack of dawn. So I made a conscious, permanent decision. I firmly stopped waiting around hoping for someone from my past to suddenly ride in and rescue me. Instead, I forged myself into a weapon, I became absolutely, terrifyingly relentless. I conquered the curriculum and proudly graduated perfectly on time with my cohort. On the day I received my degree, not a single soul from Chicago came to sit in the audience and cheer for me. But my sheer brilliance couldn't be ignored by the medical establishment. I successfully matched into an incredibly prestigious, fiercely competitive surgical residency program at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, located back in my home state of Illinois. It was a legendary, massive, sprawling trauma hospital. It was widely known as one of the most chaotic, busiest trauma centers in the entire state. It was within the chaotic, blood-stained walls of St. Jude's that I first met Dr. Helen Croft. Helen was a force of nature, and she quickly stepped up to become my trusted mentor. As the brutal years of residency ground on, she evolved into the absolute closest thing I had left in the world to a genuine mother figure. Professionally, she was razor-sharp, insanely demanding, thoroughly terrifying to the junior staff, and above all else, fiercely, violently protective of the young doctors she selected for her surgical residents. I vividly recall one particularly horrifying night, shortly after we had lost a patient during a brutally long, incredibly bloody surgery. Helen had managed to find me quietly crying into my scrubs, hidden away in a cramped, dark surgical supply closet. Most attendings would have yelled or demanded explanations. Instead of bombarding me with invasive questions, she simply reached out, handed me a rough box of hospital tissues, and delivered a speech that permanently altered my brain chemistry. "You are unequivocally one of the strongest, most capable residents I have ever had the privilege to train," she stated firmly. "Stop constantly apologizing to the universe for simply surviving." I etched those profound words into my very soul. I never, ever forgot that moment. As I clawed my way into my third grueling year of surgical residency, the universe finally decided to show me some mercy, and I met Julian Hayes. Julian was a brilliant, deeply empathetic civil rights and environmental attorney. He possessed incredibly kind, warm eyes that seemed to see right through my armor. He had a wickedly dry sense of humor that could cut the tension in any room. From the moment we connected, he became instantly the most fundamentally safe human being I had ever known in my entire life. Months into dating, sitting on his couch, I finally found the courage to verbally unpack my trauma and told him absolutely everything regarding the horrifying betrayal of my family. As the devastating story poured out of me, he never once tried to interrupt. He didn't look at me with sickening, overwhelming pity. He completely refrained from trying to actively fix my broken psychology. He just sat there, holding space, and intensely listened to every word. When I finally finished crying and fell silent, he simply looked at me and said 4 deeply profound words. "You sincerely deserved infinitely better, Clara." I almost completely broke down crying all over again, simply upon hearing that validation. Because throughout my entire 30 years of existence, absolutely nobody sharing my biological DNA in my own family had ever bothered to say it. We fell deeply in love and got married exactly 2 years later. We intentionally kept it small and intimate, hosting a beautiful little backyard wedding ceremony. We invited exactly 30 carefully chosen guests. The evening was illuminated by strings of warm, glowing fairy lights strung through the trees. The crisp, biting October air provided the perfect backdrop. Despite the years of silence, my conscience demanded I try one last time, so I formally mailed elegant wedding invitations to my parents' house. Unsurprisingly, the heavy envelope eventually came back to my mailbox, completely sealed and unopened. Again. But the sting was less potent this time. When the music started, Julian's incredibly warm, supportive father proudly stepped up and walked me gracefully down the grassy aisle in their place. Sitting in the front row, my Aunt Eleanor openly cried heavy, joyous tears, weeping enough to completely compensate for all 3 of my glaringly absent family members. Immediately after the beautiful ceremony concluded, Dr. Helen Croft approached me with a sly smile and handed me a thick, securely sealed envelope. "It's an official hospital award nomination," she stated simply, tapping the paper. "Don't open it now. You'll fully understand what it means later." I gratefully tucked the mysterious envelope away into my bag and joyfully moved on with building the rest of my life. The relentless march of time continued, and 5 more years rapidly passed by in a blur of blood, scalpels, and saving lives. Through sheer, terrifying competence, I rapidly ascended the hospital hierarchy and officially became the undisputed chief of trauma surgery at St. Jude's Memorial. I painstakingly built a beautiful, incredibly warm home. I nurtured a deeply loving, unshakable marriage. I aggressively carved out a magnificent, fulfilling life that belonged entirely and exclusively to me. But the brutal truth about deep psychological trauma is that even when you spend years diligently working to heal, some of the deepest wounds permanently leave lingering ghosts behind. Every single time the Thanksgiving holiday rolled around, despite the immense joy in my home, my eyes inevitably drifted to and still painfully noticed the glaring empty seats at my dining table. Every time Christmas morning arrived, as I unwrapped gifts with Julian, a tiny, fractured part of my inner child still agonizingly wondered if my parents ever actually stopped to think about me. Throughout the black hole of silence, Aunt Eleanor was the only one who faithfully stayed in consistent contact with me. She carefully fed me small, highly sanitized updates regarding the family dynamic. I learned through her that Vanessa's toxic behavior finally caught up to her, and she had gotten messily divorced from her husband. I was relieved to hear that both Mom and Dad were still generally healthy and aging normally. But despite Eleanor's subtle prodding, nobody from that house ever once attempted to reach out to me. Then, exactly 1 week before the tectonic plates of my universe violently shifted and absolutely everything changed, Eleanor called my phone, her voice trembling and sounding incredibly nervous. "Clara," she started, her tone carefully measured and cautious. "There's something incredibly important you really need to know regarding Vanessa." But right before she could manage to finish her sentence and deliver the news, the harsh, shrill scream of my hospital pager violently went off at my hip. It was a massive trauma activation code. Duty called. I quickly interrupted her, promising I would absolutely call her right back as soon as I was out of surgery. I tragically never got the chance to return that specific phone call, because in a horrifying twist of cosmic irony, at that exact, precise moment in time, my estranged sister Vanessa was recklessly driving her vehicle violently down the rain-slicked asphalt of Interstate 90, speeding dangerously directly toward a glowing red intersection light that she would, tragically, never manage to stop for. My muscle memory took over instantly. I threw off the warm covers and dressed incredibly fast in the pitch black. I sprinted to my car and aggressively drove my vehicle through the blinding, freezing sheets of torrential Chicago rain. As my windshield wipers violently slapped back and forth, my highly trained brain rapidly ran through an exhaustive list of terrifying surgical possibilities and complex emergency procedures. I slammed through the hospital's sliding glass doors, sprinted directly into the chaotic, brightly lit trauma bay, and immediately grabbed the glowing electronic intake tablet from the frantic charge nurse. My entire biological system experienced a massive, instantaneous short circuit, and my physical body went completely, terrifyingly still. For 2 excruciatingly long, agonizing seconds, the air evaporated from my lungs, and I literally could not remember how to breathe. But then, thousands of hours of grueling, relentless surgical training forcefully, violently took over my frozen neurology. "Prep operating room number 2, right now," I ordered loudly, my voice booming with absolute, unquestionable authority over the chaotic din of the bay. The screaming ambulance abruptly arrived at the loading dock mere seconds later. The paramedics violently kicked the heavy doors open and rushed the gurney inside. Vanessa looked absolutely, terrifyingly terrible. Massive, horrifying amounts of dark crimson blood had completely soaked through the fabric of her torn shirt. Her normally radiant, perfectly manicured skin was shockingly, deathly pale. Her agonizing breathing was incredibly shallow, rattling violently in her chest with every desperate gasp for oxygen. And then I saw them, running frantically right behind the bloody stretcher, completely ignoring hospital protocol, came my estranged parents. They were entirely panicked. They were absolutely terrified. And looking at them under the harsh fluorescent glare, I realized with a jolt that they looked significantly older than the ghosts I held in my memory. My father frantically grabbed the arm of a passing scrub nurse, his eyes wild with terror. "Where is the chief surgeon? Please, you have to help my daughter right now," he screamed desperately into the hallway. The startled nurse immediately pivoted and glanced nervously directly toward where I was standing in command. Her eyes widened significantly in sudden, jarring recognition when she rapidly read the bold lettering printed on my official hospital badge. I caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible, tiny shake of my head to stop her. "Not yet," my eyes communicated silently. We didn't have the precious time to deal with the inevitable emotional fallout of an explosive family reunion while a patient was actively bleeding out on the gurney. Hospital security gently but firmly intervened, and my hysterical parents were physically guided away from the trauma bay and escorted down the long hall directly into the sterile confines of the family waiting room, while I aggressively scrubbed my hands and forearms with harsh iodine in the sink. Standing completely alone in the echoing, stark white scrub room, the water rushing loudly over my hands, I slowly looked up and simply stared into my own dark, exhausted eyes, reflecting back at me in the glass mirror. 5 long, agonizing years. 5 entire years of complete, soul-crushing silence. And now, in a twist of fate too cruel for fiction, the exact woman who had single-handedly, maliciously caused every single ounce of that immense suffering was actively bleeding out of her veins, dying right on my cold steel operating table. A very dark, deeply buried part of my exhausted human soul screamed at me, desperately wanting to just turn around and walk away from the sink. I could easily page the on-call backup and let another highly qualified surgeon step in and handle the immense, terrifying pressure of the case. But regardless of her horrifying sins, Vanessa was actively dying on that table. And the cold, undeniable, objective truth of the matter was that the absolute best, most highly skilled trauma surgeon in that entire sprawling hospital complex was me. I took a deep, shuddering breath, kicked the sterile doors open with my foot, and confidently walked directly into the blinding lights of the operating room. 3 grueling, agonizing hours and 40 incredibly tense minutes. That is exactly how incredibly long I stood over that sterile table, fighting a brutal, terrifying war against the Grim Reaper, desperately trying to save her shattered life. The internal damage was absolutely catastrophic. She had a massive, completely ruptured spleen. She had sustained terrifyingly severe, complex physical damage to the lobes of her liver. The massive internal bleeding in her abdominal cavity was nearly impossible to control. But through all the spraying blood and frantic alarms, my hands never shook once, not even for a single microsecond. Because the moment I crossed the threshold and stepped fully inside the sterile confines of the OR, the bleeding woman under the blue drapes was absolutely no longer my treacherous sister. She was completely stripped of her identity. She was strictly, solely, my medical patient. And a core tenet of the oath I swore is that patients absolutely do not deserve to be the victims of personal revenge. No matter who they are, they strictly deserve the absolute highest standard of medical care. Finally, as the digital clock on the wall flashed exactly 6:48 a.m., my gloved hands meticulously placed the absolute final, life-saving suture into her torn flesh. Vanessa's wildly erratic vitals finally stabilized on the monitors. She was incredibly broken, but she was going to be alive. My exhausted anesthesiologist, Dr. Patel, looked across the bloody drapes at me, speaking quietly through his thick surgical mask. "Do you want me to go out there and speak to the frantic family in the waiting room?" he offered kindly. I stepped back from the table and slowly, methodically peeled my blood-soaked latex gloves from my aching hands. "No," I replied, my voice hard and resolute. "This one is absolutely mine to handle." I didn't bother changing into fresh clothes. I purposefully walked down the incredibly long, brightly lit corridor directly toward the desolate family waiting room, still wearing my heavily blood-spattered surgical scrubs, proudly displaying my official hospital identification badge clipped squarely to my chest. The heavy plastic card read in thick, bold black letters, Dr. Clara Sterling, Chief of Trauma Surgery. As I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped into the quiet room, Dad immediately vaulted out of his plastic chair, his face frantic. "How is my little girl? How is my daughter?" He practically begged the doctor entering the room. And then, his frantic eyes dropped down, intensely focused on the laminated badge resting against my chest, and his entire physical body completely froze in utter, horrifying shock. Mom, noticing his terrifying paralysis, immediately followed his stunned gaze. The exact moment she recognized my face and read the credentials, every single drop of color violently drained completely out of her terrified face. 5 full, agonizingly silent, impossibly long seconds completely ticked by, hanging thick and suffocating in the sterile air of the waiting room. Nobody breathed. Then, tapping into a well of absolute icy professionalism, I spoke in a perfectly calm, entirely detached, highly clinical voice. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, I am here to inform you that your daughter successfully survived the extensive trauma surgery. She is currently heavily sedated but stable in the intensive care unit," I recited. I purposefully did not call them Mom. I absolutely did not call them Dad. I coldly addressed them formally as Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. Hearing those incredibly formal, deeply distant titles forcefully slip past my lips physically hurt them. I could visibly see the devastating emotional impact register violently across their aging features. Mom instantly broke down and started violently, hysterically crying into her trembling hands. "Oh my God," she gasped out through the heavy sobs. "Clara, is it really you?" She desperately reached out and physically stepped forward, wanting to bridge the gap toward me. I reacted instinctively and immediately stepped backward away from her reach. It was only half a step in physical distance, but the profound emotional chasm it instantly created between us felt utterly enormous and entirely uncrossable. Dad was still standing perfectly still, looking completely, utterly shattered to his absolute core. He stared at my scrubs. You're a fully licensed doctor?" he stammered out, disbelief choking his words. "I am the undisputed chief of trauma surgery for this entire hospital," I corrected him coldly, letting the monumental weight of the title hang in the air. But Vanessa explicitly sat us down and said," he started, his brain desperately trying to reconcile the horrifying contradiction. I cut him off, my voice sharp like a scalpel. "What exactly did Vanessa tell you?" I demanded. His mouth slowly opened, then snapped closed, then helplessly opened again in confusion. Absolutely nothing coherent managed to come out of his throat. Mom finally managed to desperately whisper the lie through her heavy tears. We thought you completely failed out. We thought you dropped out of the medical program." I stared her dead in the eyes, devoid of mercy. "She looked you in the eye and told you I dropped out. She told you I cowardly disappeared into the night. She specifically told us that you callously abandoned absolutely everyone who cared about you," Mom sobbed, heavy tears now freely streaming down her deeply lined face. "She said you selfishly stopped calling the house." The injustice burned hot in my chest. "I frantically called your house exactly 14 separate times in 5 agonizing days," I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the small room. Unable to bear the crushing weight of my intense gaze, Dad slowly lowered his head and silently stared down at the scuffed linoleum floor. "I desperately emailed you my official university leave paperwork. I mailed you long, handwritten letters pleading for you to just listen," I continued relentlessly, tearing down the false history. "And you callously took my letter, wrote 'return to sender' on it, and sent exactly 1 back, completely unopened." I delivered the final, devastating blow. The suffocating, heavy silence that immediately descended upon the room after that horrifying revelation felt absolutely, utterly endless. Just outside the room, standing safely behind the clear glass partition, A small group of the floor nurses had gathered and watched the intense drama unfold very quietly. Every single person in the vicinity fundamentally understood that something incredibly huge, deeply personal, and completely catastrophic was actively happening in that room. Eventually, Dad managed to swallow his pride and finally spoke, trying to regain control. This hospital waiting room is absolutely not the appropriate place for this kind of intense family discussion, he deflected weakly. I completely ignored his attempt to dictate the terms. I looked him directly, fiercely, and unflinchingly in the eyes. I just spent nearly 4 grueling, bloody hours standing on my feet saving Vanessa's miserable life, I said, my voice dripping with absolute authority. I personally think we are already way past the concept of appropriate timing. He was completely disarmed. He had absolutely no logical defensive response to offer. For the absolute first time in my entire 32 years of life, my towering, intimidating father looked incredibly, pitifully small. Right at that incredibly tense moment, one of my senior floor nurses bravely approached the open doorway. She looked at me respectfully. "Dr. Sterling, the hospital board explicitly wanted me to track you down and officially tell you congratulations," she said casually, completely unaware of the radioactive dynamic. The prestigious Physician of the Year committee finally officially finalized their selection for the award. Mom slowly stopped crying and just completely stared at me, completely awestruck. "You won Physician of the Year?" she repeated, the words sounding alien to her. "It's honestly just a standard internal hospital recognition," I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with my parents. But the devastating psychological damage to their false reality was already completely, irrevocably done. My deeply misguided parents finally, forcefully saw the absolute, undeniable truth, proudly standing directly in front of their very eyes. I was not a miserable, disgraced failure. I was absolutely not a deceitful, pathological liar. I was a highly respected, brilliant trauma surgeon. I was a decorated hospital leader. And tragically, I was the very daughter they had so easily, callously abandoned over a fabricated story. I had said my piece. I abruptly turned on my heel and started to confidently walk out of the room to leave. As I reached the doorway, I clearly heard my mother's completely broken, devastated whisper echo from right behind me. "Arthur, oh my God, Arthur, what on earth have we done?" Several agonizing hours later, the heavy sedation finally began to wear off, and Vanessa slowly, groggily woke up in her dark room. I silently pushed the heavy door open and confidently entered her private ICU room to perform a strictly routine, highly clinical post-op medical check on my patient. As the drugs cleared her mind, she looked around the machinery, incredibly confused about her surroundings, until her bleary eyes finally managed to focus and read the bold text on my hospital badge. The exact instant she processed the information, a look of pure, unadulterated, primal terror rapidly spread completely across her pale, bruised face. You're an actual doctor," she whispered, her voice incredibly hoarse from the intubation tube. "I am officially your attending surgeon," I stated coldly, checking the monitors. She just silently, terrifyingly stared at me from the bed. I could practically see the gears violently turning in her head, desperately trying to mentally process the massive, catastrophic shift in reality. And then, almost instinctively, came the toxic, familiar calculation. That distinctly recognizable, incredibly manipulative look crept back into her eyes. Even while lying physically broken in a hospital bed, she was already frantically searching her brain for a brand new, clever angle to spin the narrative in her favor. "Clara, please, I can fully explain everything," she whispered, deploying her most pathetic, victimized tone. I didn't flinch. I slowly raised my hand and simply pointed directly toward the hallway. "You don't need to explain anything to me. You need to explain it all to them," I said, firmly nodding toward the glass window where our frantic parents currently stood outside in the corridor. Then, without uttering another single word, I turned my back on her and walked entirely out of the room. The chaotic aftermath of what happened next in that room rapidly spread through the gossip mill of the entire ICU floor within a single hour. According to the nurses, Vanessa predictably immediately started crying hysterically. She desperately tried to play the role of the tragic, misunderstood victim. She wildly claimed that her lies were somehow altruistic, that she was secretly just trying to protect absolutely everyone from unnecessary stress. But for the first time in his entire adult life, Dad finally stopped blindly accepting her narrative and started aggressively asking her difficult questions. Real, deeply probing, inescapable questions regarding the timeline and the alleged proof. And once the brilliant facade of the truth finally started visibly cracking wide open under the pressure, the entire elaborate house of cards completely and rapidly collapsed, fast into absolute dust. The final nail in the coffin arrived shortly after. Aunt Eleanor stormed into the ICU waiting room, looking incredibly fierce and utterly prepared for war. She carried a massive, thick binder stuffed completely full of damning evidence. Highly detailed printed screenshots, hundreds of pages of desperate emails, and the undeniable, concrete proof comprising every single legal document I had desperately sent to her over the incredibly long years. With ruthless precision, Eleanor laid the binder on the table and forcefully showed my devastated parents the exact university-stamped medical leave paperwork. She showed them the beautiful, framed graduation photo from my residency. She made them read through the agonizingly long, incredibly desperate old emails where I was practically begging them on my hands and knees to just listen to my side of the story. And for the grand finale, Eleanor pulled out her phone and loudly read one of Vanessa's actual text messages aloud to the entire room. "Whatever you do, please absolutely don't tell Mom and Dad any details about Clara's new surgical residency. They are finally at peace without her drama in their lives." The entire waiting room immediately went dead silent. Mom just sat completely paralyzed in her plastic chair, endlessly reading my desperate, agonizing emails, one right after another. At one particularly painful point, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her colossal failure as a mother, she forcefully covered her mouth with her trembling hands and just started violently shaking with silent sobs. Dad, completely incapable of facing the horrifying reality of what he had allowed to happen, completely turned his body away and stared blankly out toward the rainy hospital window. Aunt Eleanor later confided in me that it was the absolute first time in her entire life she had ever actually seen her brother cry. He was a man made of stone. He absolutely never shed a single tear at tragic family funerals. He completely maintained his composure during horrifying, massive financial disasters. Never, not once. But he openly, violently cried that fateful day in the waiting room because the horrifying, undeniable weight of the truth finally aggressively cornered him, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Late that same exhausting afternoon, after my shift officially ended, I cautiously returned to Vanessa's dimly lit ICU room. My parents, looking like hollowed-out shells of their former selves, immediately stood up the second I crossed the threshold. Mom looked completely, utterly psychologically broken. "Clara, my God, I am just so incredibly, deeply sorry for everything," she choked out. I slowly held up a single, firm hand to immediately stop her apologies. "I genuinely, truly believe that you are incredibly sorry," I stated calmly, devoid of emotion. "But you need to realize that sorry is just a minor beginning to a process. It is absolutely not an ending." Dad aggressively swallowed hard, trying to maintain his shattered composure. We desperately want to do whatever it takes to completely fix this," he pleaded. "If that's true, you need to firmly understand something massive first," I said, keeping my voice incredibly quiet but dangerously sharp. "I am absolutely not the same terrified, desperate little girl you so easily abandoned 5 entire years ago. I meticulously, aggressively built an incredibly beautiful, successful life completely without you," I declared. "If you have any desire whatsoever to ever be a part of it now, the relationship proceeds entirely, strictly on my specific terms." Dad slowly nodded his head, completely accepting the reality. For the first time in his life, he wasn't aggressively arguing back. He wasn't desperately defending his terrible actions. He was finally, genuinely just standing there and intensely listening to me. That entirely new dynamic alone felt completely, utterly surreal to witness. I shifted my gaze past them and stared directly at Vanessa lying in the hospital bed. When you are physically well enough to recover, you and I are going to have a very long, very real conversation about your actions, I warned her coldly. Exactly 2 painfully long weeks later, after she was discharged, we officially met up at a quiet, unassuming local coffee shop, deliberately choosing entirely neutral ground. Julian, ever the fiercely protective attorney, sat at a nearby table, quietly reviewing thick legal documents, keeping a watchful eye over the proceedings. Vanessa walked in and sat down across from me. She looked incredibly exhausted, and physically smaller somehow, stripped of her usual arrogant aura. For the absolute first time in her entire pampered life, she genuinely looked completely unsure of herself. I completely refused to waste precious time on pleasantries. "Why did you do it?" I demanded simply, the question hanging heavy in the air. She nervously stared down deep into her black coffee for a very long time, before finally, quietly, answering the question. "I did it because you were rapidly, successfully becoming absolutely everything that I fundamentally wasn't," she confessed bitterly. I sat there, perfectly quiet, absorbing the toxic jealousy. "Congratulations," I finally replied. "That is the absolute first genuinely honest thing you've ever said to me in years." She broke down and started aggressively crying right there in the crowded cafe. They were genuine, real tears of profound regret. "I'm so incredibly sorry, Clara," she sobbed. "I completely know that you are," I replied coldly. "But your profound sorrow absolutely doesn't magically give me back my ruined wedding day. And it certainly doesn't give me back the 5 completely lost years of my life." Then, pushed by the need to completely unburden her rotting conscience, she tearfully admitted to doing something infinitely worse than the initial lie. She confessed that, years ago, she had actually maliciously contacted the administration of my medical school, using an anonymous phone number, actively trying to aggressively get my medical leave of absence permanently revoked by the university. She had deliberately, actively tried to completely and permanently destroy my entire future in medicine out of pure spite. I stared at her in utter, horrifying disbelief at the sheer magnitude of her psychotic cruelty. "Your dean of medicine absolutely refused to believe my anonymous claims," she whispered, her voice filled with pathetic shame. "That's because the undeniable, documented truth fiercely protected me from your lies," I stated firmly, refusing to give her an inch of grace. I reached into my bag and forcefully laid out the exact, non-negotiable conditions for her continued existence in my periphery. Completely defeated and out of manipulative options, she immediately agreed to my strict terms. Later that week, I officially met with my parents separately, gathering at the exact same polished oak kitchen table where the entire nightmare had originally, horribly begun. I looked them directly in the eyes and firmly told them that if they possessed any real desire to slowly rebuild a relationship with me, they desperately needed to enter intense psychological therapy. Real, deeply uncomfortable professional family therapy. Dad, completely reverting to his old habits, instinctively resisted the demand immediately. We simply don't do that kind of stuff in this family," he argued stubbornly. And that blatant toxic avoidance is exactly why this horrific situation happened in the first place, I fired back instantly, shutting down his archaic excuses. Mom firmly reached out and forcefully squeezed his arm, silently pleading with him to stop fighting. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and he reluctantly agreed to the grueling terms. The subsequent months passed incredibly slowly, filled with painfully awkward interactions, but they were finally brutally honest. Mom began taking the initiative and wrote me deeply personal letters. They were real, profoundly insightful letters. They were completely devoid of pathetic excuses. They were overflowing with genuine, difficult accountability for her massive failures as a protector. She openly, painfully admitted in ink that she had cowardly spent decades actively choosing her own comfortable ignorance over basic parental fairness. Dad predictably struggled significantly more with the demanding process. His massive, fragile ego and stubborn pride had entirely ruled his behaviors for decades. But, very slowly, little by little, breaking down his massive walls, he genuinely started showing microscopic signs of changing for the better. Vanessa held up her end of the bargain and finally sent the massive, humiliating family-wide email. Exactly 47 different extended relatives simultaneously received the brutal, unvarnished truth about her sociopathic deception. The reactions were wildly varied. Some relatives angrily replied with fiery emails filled with intense rage. Some responded expressing their deep, crushing disappointment in her character. Many simply chose to never respond to her message at all, letting the silence condemn her. The incredible, unquestioned reservoir of trust that Vanessa had meticulously, manipulatively built up over 35 long years completely disappeared into the ether almost overnight. Absolutely nobody screamed at her in public. None of the aunts or uncles dramatically officially disowned her from the bloodline. They simply completely stopped believing a single word that came out of her mouth. And for a deeply raging narcissist like Vanessa, being permanently stripped of her credibility and influence was absolutely, profoundly devastating. A year later, the highly anticipated Physician of the Year Gala finally arrived. It was an incredibly massive, lavish event. Exactly 200 wealthy, influential people completely filled the massive, glittering ballroom. The crowd consisted of highly respected doctors, wealthy hospital leaders, and powerful corporate board members. When my name was announced, I proudly walked onto the brightly lit stage while the entire room erupted in thunderous, sustained applause. And sitting quietly at a small table near the absolute back of the massive room sat my parents. They were sitting closely together, proudly watching me accept the monumental honor. From the stage, I could see Dad looked incredibly emotional and overwhelmed. Mom, naturally, was already heavily crying into her napkin. I stood confidently at the polished wooden podium, adjusted the microphone, and intentionally kept my acceptance speech incredibly simple and profoundly direct. Exactly 5 years ago, I genuinely, truly thought that utterly losing my family would completely destroy me. I spoke clearly into the microphone, my voice echoing across the silent ballroom. Instead, surviving that immense tragedy violently forced me to aggressively build a life that was strong enough to thrive and survive entirely without needing their approval. I paused and slowly looked out across the sea of faces. I looked directly toward Julian, my rock. I looked toward Helen, my fierce mentor. I looked toward Aunt Eleanor, my faithful defender. And then, finally, I deliberately locked eyes with my parents sitting in the shadows. Sometimes, the amazing people who actively choose to love you become your actual, real family, I stated firmly. And sometimes, the deeply flawed people who completely lost you eventually manage to painfully find their way back, even if it is significantly later than they absolutely should have. Hearing those words, Mom forcefully covered her trembling mouth with her hands to stifle a loud sob. Dad, breaking his stoic facade, was the first person in the entire room to forcefully stand up during the massive round of applause that followed. After the lavish gala officially concluded, Dad slowly approached Julian as we were standing near the crowded coat check. He looked incredibly nervous. I absolutely should have been the man who walked her proudly down the aisle on her wedding day, Dad said quietly, his voice filled with profound, heavy regret. Julian, always the protector, didn't offer him fake comfort. He just slowly nodded his head. Yes, Arthur, you absolutely should have been, he agreed firmly. Dad's tired eyes instantly filled completely to the brim with heavy, sorrowful tears. But, despite the harsh truth, Julian still reached out his hand and firmly shook my father's hand in a gesture of tentative, cautious respect. and that small, tiny gesture profoundly mattered in the grand scheme of things. True, deep psychological healing absolutely did not magically happen overnight. Honestly, the process still hasn't fully concluded to this day. Some of the deepest, most horrifying emotional wounds permanently leave massive scars that never fully disappear from your soul. But eventually, with enough time and effort, they finally stop actively bleeding all over everything. Now, we have reached a fragile new equilibrium. My cautious parents sometimes come over to my beautiful house on quiet Sunday mornings. In the beginning, the visits were incredibly, painfully awkward. Everyone was excessively careful with their words. The interactions were incredibly gentle, almost fragile. It felt exactly like everyone in the room was desperately trying to learn an entirely new, incredibly complex foreign language. I clearly remember one incredibly quiet, snowy winter morning. They arrived at the house while Julian and I were busy making a massive breakfast in the kitchen. Dad stood awkwardly in the center of my warm kitchen, looking completely uncertain of his place in my home. Then he cautiously stepped forward and asked incredibly quietly, "Clara, can I please help you with anything?" Hearing that specific, seemingly mundane question genuinely nearly broke my entire heart in half. My stoic, demanding father had absolutely never, ever asked me how he could actively help me before. He had never offered his assistance once in the entire duration of my childhood. I swallowed the lump in my throat and slowly handed him a heavy stack of ceramic breakfast plates. "You can go ahead and set the dining room table," I instructed him softly. He took the heavy dishes and walked to the table. He stood there and counted them incredibly carefully out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, he muttered. Then he completely paused, turning his head to look back at me in the kitchen. He looked confused. 4 plates? He asked. 4 plates, I confirmed with a small, genuine smile. He slowly nodded his head, fully understanding the beautiful implication of inclusion, and he reached down and set the absolute last heavy ceramic plate down onto the polished wood incredibly gently. He handled the cheap dishware like it was an incredibly fragile, precious, ancient artifact. Meanwhile, Mom walked over and wrapped her arms around me, hugging me tightly by the hot stove. It wasn't a wildly theatrical, dramatically exaggerated hug for show. It wasn't like a sweeping scene pulled directly from a cheesy, emotional movie. It was just a profoundly quiet, deeply genuine embrace. She was just tightly holding on to her daughter. Outside the massive, frost-covered windows, the pure white snow fell incredibly softly over the city. Julian hummed a tune and poured dark, steaming coffee into the mugs. Our goofy golden retriever, fiercely dedicated to his mission, waited patiently on the rug for any stray crumbs to miraculously fall under the table. And for the absolute first time in many long, incredibly dark years, my entire biological family sat down together in peace, right inside my own house. It was absolutely not a perfect, flawless dynamic. The deep, agonizing trauma was definitely not completely, miraculously healed. But the connection we shared in that room was fundamentally, undeniably real. And at the end of the day, having something real matters infinitely more than having a flawless illusion. I absolutely did not execute a dramatic, explosive plot to get fiery revenge on my treacherous sister. The incredible truth is, I ultimately realized that I completely didn't even need to seek revenge against her. The agonizing crucible of her betrayal had forced me to forge myself into an incredibly powerful woman, someone completely, undeniably strong enough to absolutely not need it. And somehow, by an incredible twist of cosmic justice, my complete and utter indifference to her existence ended up hurting her significantly more than any calculated petty revenge plot ever possibly could. The overwhelming, undeniable power of the truth eventually managed to find all of us in the end. It absolutely didn't conquer the darkness through chaotic, dramatic screaming matches in the street. It wasn't achieved through elaborate, malicious punishments. It completely won through the sheer, undeniable force of objective reality. The truth triumphed through the incredible, magnificent life I stubbornly built with my own 2 hands, while they all deliberately chose to look the other way. My name is Dr. Clara Sterling. I am proudly 32 years old, and after enduring agonizing years of being completely treated like I was a ghost who absolutely didn't belong anywhere on this earth, I am finally, slowly, beautifully learning exactly how to allow myself to truly belong in the world again. We are rebuilding the bridges. We are taking it one single, fragile plate at a time. One incredibly careful, honest conversation at a time. One quiet, snowy Sunday morning at a time. 4 plates sitting securely on the table. It is a very small, incredibly beautiful start. If the profound emotional journey detailed within this incredible story fundamentally moved your soul, or deeply resonated with your own personal struggles, please don't forget to actively like the video and hit subscribe on the channel to ensure you receive more intense, gripping, real-life stories exactly like this one. And please, tell me your thoughts in the comments section below. Exactly what would you have done if you were forced to stand in my shoes?